Emma Thompson stood at the entrance of Riverside Secondary School, her hands gripping her backpack straps so tightly her knuckles turned white. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. All around her, students laughed and chatted with their friends, their voices echoing through the busy hallways. But Emma felt like she was standing on an island, completely cut off from everyone else. Moving to this small English town had been hard enough, but starting at a new school in the middle of year 8 felt impossible. Emma missed her old friends, her old teachers, and the comfortable feeling of knowing where she belonged. Here, everything was different and scary. Her father, Mr. David Thompson, had gotten a big promotion to become the new headmaster of Riverside Secondary. It was a dream job for him, but Emma had made him promise to keep their relationship a secret. She wanted other students to like her for who she was, not because her dad was in charge of the school. That morning at breakfast, her father had tried to encourage her. He buttered his toast and looked at her with kind eyes. "Just be yourself, sweetheart," he had said in his gentle voice. "You're kind, smart, and brave. The right people will see that and want to be your friend." Emma had nodded, but inside she felt nervous butterflies dancing in her stomach. Being yourself was easy when you knew who you were supposed to be, but in a new place with new people, even that felt confusing. Now, standing in the hallway, Emma took a deep breath and checked her schedule one more time. Room 15B, English Literature with Mrs. Clark. Emma loved reading and writing, so at least this class should be okay. She followed the room numbers down the corridor until she found the right door. The English classroom looked welcoming at first glance. Bright posters covered the walls with quotes from famous writers like Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with novels and poetry collections. The desks were ranged in a horseshoe shape, which Emma thought would make discussions more friendly. But when Emma walked through the doorway, something changed in the air. Mrs. Patricia Clark stood at the front of the room, a woman in her 50s with steel grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her clothes were neat and pressed, but there was something cold about her appearance. When she looked at Emma, her expression shifted from neutral to something that felt almost hostile. "You must be the new student," Mrs. Clark said in a flat, unwelcoming voice. She didn't smile or try to make Emma feel comfortable. "Find a seat at the back of the room." Emma felt her cheeks grow warm with embarrassment. She had hoped for a friendlier welcome, maybe a kind word or a smile. Instead, she quietly made her way to an empty desk in the back corner, trying not to look at the other students who were watching her as she sat down. A girl with curly brown hair turned round and smiled at her. "I'm Lucy," she whispered. "Welcome to our class." A boy sitting nearby leaned over and offered to share his textbook. "I'm James," he said quietly. "Don't worry, you'll like it here." Their kindness made Emma feel a little better, but she could still feel Mrs. Clark's cold stare from the front of the room. The lesson began, and Mrs. Clark started discussing a Shakespeare play they had been reading. Emma had read this play at her old school and knew it well. When Mrs. Clark asked a question about the main character's feelings, Emma carefully raised her hand. But Mrs. Clark looked right through her, as if Emma was invisible. She called on other students instead, even though Emma's hand was up first. When Emma finally got a chance to speak and gave a correct answer, Mrs. Clark barely nodded. "Some students think they know everything," Mrs. Clark muttered under her breath, but loud enough for the whole class to hear. Emma felt her face burn with shame. She had only been trying to participate like a good student should. She couldn't understand what she had done wrong. As the days turned into weeks, the pattern continued and got worse. Mrs. Clark would ask Emma much harder questions than she asked other students. When Emma tried to speak during discussions, the teacher would interrupt her or cut her off. Mrs. Clark made strange comments about certain types of students who probably don't read much at home. Each day, Emma's confidence crumbled a little more. She stopped raising her hand in class. She began to doubt her own abilities and wonder if maybe she really wasn't as smart as she thought. Every morning when she woke up, her stomach would feel sick thinking about facing English class again. But deep inside, Emma held on to her father's words about being brave. She didn't understand why Mrs. Clark treated her so differently from the other students. But she knew in her heart that it wasn't right. One grey afternoon after another difficult class, Lucy walked over to Emma's desk as she was packing her books. "Emma, are you okay?" Lucy asked gently, her voice full of concern. "I've been watching how Mrs. Clark treats you. It's not fair at all." For the first time in weeks, Emma felt a tiny spark of hope light up in her chest. Maybe she hadn't been imagining things. Maybe someone else could see what was happening too. "I don't know what I did wrong," Emma whispered, and tears began to form in her eyes. James joined them, his face serious. "You didn't do anything wrong," he said firmly. "Mrs. Clark is the one with the problem, not you." Em looked at her new friends and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't completely alone anymore. The weeks that followed were like walking through a storm that never ended. Emma felt as if dark clouds followed her everywhere she went, especially into Mrs. Clark's English classroom. Each day brought new challenges that seemed designed to crush her spirit completely. One Tuesday morning, Mrs. Clark announced they would be writing poetry about memories that meant something special to them. Emma's eyes lit up for the first time in days. Poetry was something she truly loved, and she had so many beautiful memories to choose from. She decided to write about her grandmother's garden, a magical place from her childhood where she had spent countless summer afternoons. Emma closed her eyes and let the memories flow onto the paper. She wrote about the sweet smell of pink roses that climbed the old wooden fence. She described how golden sunlight danced through the apple tree leaves, creating patterns on the grass. Below, she remembered her grandmother's gentle hands showing her how to plant seeds and the joy of watching tiny green shoots push through the dark soil. Emma poured her whole heart into that poem. She carefully chose each word, making sure the rhythm felt just right. When she finished, she read it over and felt proud of what she had created. It was honest and beautiful, full of love and clear, vivid pictures that would help readers see and feel what she had experienced. The next day, Mrs. Clark stood at the front of the classroom holding a stack of poems. "I'll read some of the better examples aloud," she announced. Emma sat up straighter in her chair, hoping to hear her words shared with the class. Mrs. Clark began reading different students' work. "This next one is quite good," she said, holding up Lucy's poem about her pet cat. "It shows real understanding and feeling. Listen to how the writer uses descriptive words to paint a picture." Emma listened as Lucy's poem was read aloud. It was nice, but Emma felt confused. Her own poem had used just as many descriptive words and painted equally clear pictures. She looked at Mrs. Clark's desk and saw her own paper sitting there, unmarked and forgotten. One by one, Mrs. Clark read poems from other students. She praised Michael's poem about playing football. She called Sophie's piece about her little brother very insightful and mature. But Emma's poem about her grandmother's garden was never mentioned. After class, Emma gathered her courage and approached Mrs. Clark's desk. Her poem still sat there, untouched. "Excuse me, Mrs. Clark," Emma said politely. "I was wondering about my poem. Did you have a chance to read it?" Mrs. Clark barely looked up from the papers she was organizing. Her voice was cold and dismissive. Some students need to focus on basic grammar before attempting creative writing, she said without even glancing at Emma's work. Perhaps you should spend more time on fundamentals instead of trying to be fancy. Emma felt like someone had punched her in the stomach. She looked down at her poem. Written in her neat handwriting, she had checked her grammar carefully. She had always been a strong writer at her old school. Her teachers there had often praised her creative pieces and encouraged her to keep writing. But Mrs. Clark's words made Emma question everything she thought she knew about herself. Maybe she really wasn't as good as she thought. Maybe her writing was childish and full of mistakes she couldn't even see. The situation grew even worse during their class discussions about the books they were reading. Emma had always loved talking about stories and characters. She would think carefully about the books and come up with thoughtful ideas to share with the class. But when Emma raised her hand and shared her insights, Mrs. Clark would frown and quickly move on to someone else. "That's one way to look at it, I suppose," she would say in a flat voice, or sometimes she would simply ignore Emma's comment completely. Yet when other students made similar points, Mrs. Clark's whole face would light up with enthusiasm. "Excellent point, Michael," she would say with a big smile. "You really understand what the author was trying to say." Or she would nod approvingly at Sophie and say, "Very insightful observation. That shows deep thinking." Emma began to notice this pattern everywhere. In group work, her ideas were dismissed or overlooked. When she asked questions, they were answered briefly and without warmth. Her homework assignments came back with harsh comments that seemed much stricter than what other students received. Slowly, Emma's grades began to slip. It wasn't because she had become less smart or stopped trying. The hostile environment made it nearly impossible to focus on learning. Every time she walked into the classroom, her heart would start beating fast with anxiety. Her usually bright smile faded away, replaced by a worried, uncertain expression. Emma started to believe that maybe Mrs. Clark was right about her. Maybe she wasn't smart enough for the school. Maybe she didn't belong here after all. At home, Emma tried hard to hide her struggles from her family. She knew her father worked long hours trying to make the school a better place for all the students. He often came home tired from dealing with budgets and meetings and parent complaints. The last thing Emma wanted was to add her problems to his already heavy load. But mothers have a special way of noticing when something is wrong with their children. Mrs. Sarah Thompson began to see changes in her daughter that worried her deeply. Emma, who used to bounce through the front door each afternoon chattering excitedly about her classes and friends, now came home quiet and withdrawn. "How is school today, love?" her mother would ask gently, setting down a plate of Emma's favorite biscuits. "Fine," Emma would answer, but her eyes looked sad and tired. She would go straight to her room instead of staying in the kitchen to talk like she used to do. The only bright spots in Emma's days were her friends Lucy and James. They had become her lifeline in the storm. They sat with her at lunch, making sure she wasn't alone. They walked with her between classes, filling the hallways with friendly chatter that helped drown out her worried thoughts. They could see exactly how Mrs. Clark treated Emma, and it made them angry on her behalf. "You're one of the smartest people in our year," James told her one day as they sat under a tree during lunch break. "Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." Lucy nodded firmly. "Mrs. Clark is completely wrong about you," she added. "We all know it, and deep down, you know it too." Their kindness and support kept Emma going through the difficult days. But the daily mistreatment was taking a serious toll on her health and happiness. She started having trouble falling asleep at night, lying awake worrying about what tomorrow's English class would bring. She lost her appetite and barely touched her meals. Most sadly of all, the joy she had always found in learning and reading was slowly disappearing. But Emma Thompson was her father's daughter, and she had inherited his inner strength and determination, even in her darkest moments. When she felt most alone and confused, a small but steady voice inside her heart whispered that this treatment wasn't right, and that somehow, if she could just hold on a little longer, things would get better. The day that changed everything started like any other difficult morning in Mrs. Clark's English class. Emma slumped in her usual seat at the back of the room, trying to make herself invisible. The autumn rain tapped against the tall windows, and the grey sky matched Emma's mood perfectly. Mrs. Clark stood at the front of the classroom holding a thick book with a worn cover. "Today, we'll discuss courage in literature," she announced in her usual cold voice. "We're reading a story about a young person who faces injustice in their community." Emma had read this story the night before. It was about a teenager who discovered that the adults in their town were treating some people unfairly. The main character had to decide whether to speak up or stay quiet and safe. The story had stirred something deep inside Emma's heart, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Mrs. Clark began reading parts of the story aloud, her voice flat and emotionless. When she finished, she looked round the classroom with her sharp eyes. "Now, let's discuss whether this character made the right choice. I believe the character should have stayed quiet and minded their own business." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The character in the story had been trying to help people who were being hurt by unfair treatment. Mrs. Clark continued with her cold analysis. "Sometimes it's better not to make trouble. Young people often think they understand situations that are actually much more complicated than they realize." This character should have left things alone. Emma felt her heart start beating faster. Everything about Mrs. Clark's words felt wrong to her. The character in the story had been brave and good. They had seen something terrible happening and had tried to stop it. Before Emma could stop herself, her hand shot up into the air. For weeks and weeks, she had remained silent in this classroom, accepting whatever harsh treatment came her way. But something about this moment felt completely different. "I disagree," Emma said, and even she was surprised by the strength in her voice, though it shook with nervousness. The character was absolutely right to speak up when something is wrong. Staying quiet doesn't make it go away. It just lets the wrong thing continue happening to more people. The entire classroom fell into complete silence. Emma's classmates turned to stare at her with wide eyes. They had grown used to seeing her sit quietly and accept whatever Mrs. Clark said. None of them expected to hear her speak so boldly and with such conviction. Mrs. Clark's face changed instantly. Her eyes flashed with anger, and her mouth twisted into a frown. "Miss Thompson," she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass, "we don't need your opinions on matters you clearly don't understand. Perhaps you should focus on listening rather than speaking out of turn." But something had awakened inside Emma, and she couldn't stop now. Weeks and weeks of hurt and frustration had been building up inside her like water behind a dam. All the ignored questions, all the dismissed ideas, all the unfair treatment suddenly poured out in a moment of pure, honest courage. "But I do understand," Emma said, and to everyone's amazement, she stood up from her seat. Her legs felt shaky, but her voice grew stronger with each word. "I understand exactly what it feels like when someone treats you unfairly just because of who you are. I understand what it feels like to have your voice ignored and your ideas dismissed. And I understand that staying silent doesn't help anyone at all." The room became so quiet that Emma could hear the clock ticking on the wall and the rain still pattering against the windows. Even Mrs. Clark seemed stunned by Emma's sudden transformation from quiet, defeated student to someone speaking with power and truth. Emma felt tears streaming down her cheeks. But she didn't stop talking. "I've tried so hard to be a good student in this class," she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "I've tried to work hard and be respectful and follow all the rules. But nothing I do is ever good enough for you. You treat me differently than everyone else in this room, and I don't understand why." Round the classroom, Emma could see her classmates' faces changing. Lucy and James exchanged looks of admiration and pride. Several other students began nodding their heads, finally seeing someone brave enough to speak the truth they had all witnessed but been too afraid to mention. "You ignore my questions and dismiss my ideas," Emma went on, the words flowing out like a river that had finally broken free. "You skip over my work and make comments that hurt my feelings. When other students say the same things I say, you praise them. But when I speak, you act like my words don't matter." Mrs. Clark's face turned bright red with anger. She looked like she was about to explode. "That's quite enough of this nonsense," she said in a voice that was meant to be scary and final. "Go to the headmaster's office immediately. This kind of disruptive behavior will not be tolerated in my classroom." Emma gathered her books with hands that were still shaking from the courage that had poured out of her. As she walked toward the classroom door, she heard James's voice behind her. "She's right, though," James said quietly, but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Emma is completely right about everything she said. So is she," Lucy added, and her voice was growing stronger and more confident. "We've all seen exactly how you treat her differently from the rest of us." More students began to murmur their agreement. For the first time in months, Emma realized that she hadn't been imagining things. Other people had seen the unfair treatment too. She wasn't crazy or too sensitive. She had been experiencing something real and wrong. As Emma walked down the long hallway toward her father's office, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. It was relief, pure and simple. She had finally found her voice again, and she had used it to speak her truth in front of everyone. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would get in trouble or if anything would actually change. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had done the right thing. Sometimes being brave means standing up even when your knees are shaking with fear. Sometimes finding your voice is the very first step toward making things better. Emma sat on the hard wooden chair outside her father's office, her heart beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sounds of students in their classrooms and the soft tick of the old clock on the wall. She had never been sent to the headmaster's office before in her entire school life, and the fact that the headmaster was her own father made everything feel even more strange and complicated. Her hands were still shaking from what had happened in Mrs. Clark's classroom. She kept replaying the moment when she had stood up and spoken her truth in front of everyone. Part of her felt proud and relieved, but another part worried that she had made everything worse. The office door opened, and Mr. Thompson appeared. His kind face showed concern, but his voice was calm and gentle when he spoke. "Emma, please come in. Let's talk about what happened." Emma walked into the familiar office where she had sometimes visited her father after school. Today, though, everything felt different. She sat in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where students who were in trouble usually sat. "Emma," her father said softly, "can you tell me what happened in Mrs. Clark's class today?" For the first time in months and months, Emma opened her heart completely and told her father everything. The words poured out like water from a broken dam. She described Mrs. Clark's cold looks from the very first day. She talked about the dismissive comments and the way her teacher ignored her raised hand. She explained how her work was overlooked while other students' similar work was praised. Emma told her father about the poetry assignment where her heartfelt piece about grandmother's garden was never read aloud or even acknowledged. She described how Mrs. Clark would interrupt her during discussions but encourage other students who said the same things. She talked about the comments about certain types of students and how they made her feel small and unwelcome. As Emma spoke, she watched her father's face change. His expression moved from concern to shock to something that looked like quiet, controlled anger. She could see that he was trying hard to stay calm, but his eyes showed how upset he was becoming. "Why didn't you tell me about this sooner, sweetheart?" he asked gently when she finished talking. Emma wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I wanted to handle it myself," she said through her crying. "And I didn't want people at school to think I was getting special treatment just because you're my father. I wanted to prove that I could be strong on my own." Mr. Thompson got up from behind his desk and came round to hug his daughter tightly. His arms felt warm and safe, like they had when she was a little girl with scraped knees or bad dreams. "You should never have to handle discrimination alone," he said firmly but lovingly. "And speaking up about unfair treatment isn't asking for special treatment. It's asking for a basic respect that every student deserves." The next morning, Mr. Thompson called Mrs. Clark to his office for a meeting. He decided not to mention that Emma was his daughter right away. He wanted to hear Mrs. Clark's honest thoughts about the situation without her knowing the personal connection. Mrs. Clark walked into the office looking confident and slightly annoyed. She sat down across from Mr. Thompson with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. "I understand you had some difficulties with Emma Thompson in your class yesterday," Mr. Thompson began, keeping his voice professional and neutral. Mrs. Clark's face immediately hardened like stone. Her eyes became cold, and her mouth pressed into a thin line. "That girl is nothing but disruptive and disrespectful," she said with obvious irritation. "Students like her think they can just waltz into our school and demand attention and special treatment. They don't understand the high standards we work hard to maintain here." Mr. Thompson felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his voice steady. "What do you mean by students like her?" he asked carefully. "Well, you know," Mrs. Clark said with a dismissive wave of her hand, as if the answer should be obvious. "These urban families who move here from the city and expect everything to be handed to them on a silver platter. They don't value education the way proper, established families do. They don't respect tradition and discipline." As Mr. Thompson listened to these terrible words, he felt his heart breaking for his daughter. Emma had been suffering all this time because of this teacher's unfair and cruel assumptions about who she was and where she came from. Assumptions that had nothing to do with Emma's actual character or abilities. "Mrs. Clark," he said quietly, his voice steady but serious, "Emma Thompson is my daughter." All the color drained from Mrs. Clark's face instantly. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Her confident posture collapsed, and she seemed to shrink in her chair. "Everything you just said about my daughter and families like us," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice still professional but now carrying the weight of a father's protective love, "shows a level of bias and prejudice that has absolutely no place in education. Emma is one of the brightest, kindest, most thoughtful students in this entire school, and you have made her feel unwelcome and worthless simply because of your own unfair prejudices." Mrs. Clark tried desperately to backtrack and fix what she had said. I didn't know. I never meant," she stammered, her face now red with embarrassment and panic. "The problem is that you did mean it," Mr. Thompson said firmly but professionally. "You meant every single word you said, and my daughter has suffered terribly because of it. What worries me even more is wondering how many other students you might have treated the same way over the years." A few minutes later, Emma was called back into the office. Mrs. Clark offered a stammering, awkward apology, stumbling over her words and looking down at her hands. But Emma, showing wisdom and maturity far beyond her years, looked at her teacher with eyes that were sad but clear and strong. "I forgive you, Mrs. Clark," Emma said in a steady voice. "But just saying sorry isn't enough to fix this. You need to really understand that every single student deserves respect and kindness, no matter who they are or where they come from." For the first time since Emma had entered her classroom months ago, Mrs. Clark seemed to truly see her, not as a stereotype or a set of assumptions, but as a bright, thoughtful young person who had been deeply hurt by unfair treatment she never deserved. The weeks and months that followed the meeting in Mr. Thompson's office brought changes to Riverside Secondary School that no one could have imagined. It was like watching flowers bloom after a long, cold winter. The whole atmosphere of the school began to shift towards something warmer and more welcoming. Mrs. Clark was required to attend special training sessions about treating all students fairly and with respect. She had to work with an experienced mentor teacher who helped her examine her own thoughts and feelings about different types of students. At first, Mrs. Clark was resistant and embarrassed. But slowly she began to understand how much harm her words and actions had caused. More importantly, Emma's brave decision to speak up in that classroom created ripples that spread throughout the entire school. Mr. Thompson organized special assemblies where students could share their own experiences of feeling left out or treated unfairly. Teachers attended these meetings too, learning about how their words and actions affected the young people in their care. Emma herself went through an amazing transformation. Without the constant weight of unfair treatment pressing down on her shoulders, she began to blossom back into the confident, bright girl she had always been. Her grades improved dramatically, not because she had suddenly become smarter, but because she could finally focus on learning instead of worrying about being attacked or ignored. Her love of reading and writing returned like an old friend coming home. She started raising her hand in classes again, sharing her thoughtful ideas without fear. Her teachers began to see what her father had always known, that Emma was truly one of the most intelligent and kind students in the school. As Emma grew more confident, she discovered something that surprised her. Many other students had felt like outsiders at different times during their school years. Some had been teased for being too quiet or too loud. Others had felt excluded because their families didn't have much money or because they looked different from most of their classmates. Emma decided to do something about this. With the enthusiastic support of Lucy, James, and several other friends, she started a special group called Voices That Matter. Every Thursday after school, students gathered in the library to share their experiences and support each other. The group became a safe place where young people could talk about their struggles without fear of being judged or dismissed. They helped each other with homework, but more importantly, they helped each other feel valued and heard. Students who had felt alone and misunderstood discovered that they had friends who truly cared about them. Mrs. Clark herself began to change in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Through her training sessions and long conversations with her mentor teacher, she started to see how her assumptions and prejudices had hurt students over the years. The realization was painful, but it was also the beginning of real growth. One morning, Mrs. Clark stood in front of Emma's English class and did something that took tremendous courage. She looked directly at Emma and spoke in a voice that was humble and sincere. "Emma," she said, "I owe you a public apology. I treated you unfairly because of my own narrow thinking, and I was wrong. You are a brilliant, thoughtful student, and I am sorry for the pain I caused you." It took time for trust to rebuild between them, but gradually Mrs. Clark became a better teacher, She learned to see each student as an individual with unique gifts and challenges. She started encouraging all her students to share their ideas and praised their efforts fairly. Emma's relationship with her father grew stronger and deeper during this time. She learned that asking for help when facing difficult situations wasn't a sign of weakness. It was actually a sign of wisdom and strength. She understood that even brave people need support from others sometimes. Thompson learned important lessons too. Even though he was the headmaster of the school, he realized that he needed to listen more carefully to understand what students were really experiencing in their daily lives. He started eating lunch in the cafeteria sometimes, chatting with students and learning about their concerns. The most beautiful change of all was in Emma herself. The difficult experience had tested her in ways she never expected, but it had also revealed inner strength that she didn't know she possessed. She learned that her voice mattered and that speaking truth could create positive changes that helped other people. She discovered that standing up for herself and others wasn't just brave. It was necessary for creating a world where everyone could feel safe and valued. On the last day of the school year, something wonderful happened. Emma was chosen to give a speech at the final assembly in front of the entire school. She stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, students, teachers, and parents who had come to celebrate the end of another year. This year taught me that we all have voices that matter, Emma said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the large hall. Sometimes we're afraid to use our voices because we worry about what might happen. Sometimes other people try to silence us or make us feel like our thoughts don't count. But when we speak with courage and truth, we can make our schools, our communities, and our whole world better places for everyone to live and learn. The applause that followed was thunderous and lasted for several minutes, but what meant even more to Emma was seeing understanding and inspiration in people's eyes. She had taken her painful experience and turned it into something that could help others find their own courage. As Emma walked home that warm afternoon with Lucy, James, and her other friends, she felt incredibly proud of how far she had traveled on this difficult journey. She had faced discrimination and found her voice. She had experienced unfairness and chosen to respond with forgiveness and positive action. She had felt alone and isolated, but had built a strong community of friends and supporters. Emma Thompson had learned one of life's most important and powerful lessons, that our greatest challenges often become our greatest strengths, and that every voice, especially those that speak for justice and kindness, truly matters and can change the world. The warm afternoon sun shone down on the group of friends as they laughed and made plans for their summer adventures. Emma smiled widely, knowing that no matter what challenges might come her way in the future, she now had the courage to face them and the strong, clear voice to speak her truth.